Good morning and welcome everyone to the first workshop of the Designing for Empathy Summit and Workshops for 2021. We are delighted to have you joining us here on what is a beautiful Saturday morning here in New York City. And wherever you are, I hope it is a beautiful day as well. Certainly this summit is brought to you on behalf of the Organization of Networks for Empathy, or One. And I'm very delighted to have here with us this morning, Elissa Olenski, to welcome us officially on behalf of the organization and just to say a few words before we start.
Thank you, Greg. Thank you, Monica, for being here, for leading us to the Empathy Summit month. It was supposed to be only a 3-day event, but now it's thanks to all the participants and the workshops that we're having. It just is a whole month event. So let's see where it will lead next, right? Thanks everyone for being here. And just wanted to say quickly, I've been thinking about, what is the best way or the simplest way to get across the message of the importance of empathy. And I came to, and I don't know if I'm successful at this still, it's a messaging that I'm working on constantly. But I believe that it is essential for us to be able to solve our really important and pressing and increasingly complex societal and environmental problems. We need to find a way to teach individuals that we are all a part of a whole, and we are intricate to it. So whatever happens to it, whatever goes on there, actually affects us because we are not apart from it. We are one with it. And but this type of pragmatic perspective shift from this, I-centric worldviews, which we normally go through our lives with, to a worldview where the self considers itself as part of something greater than itself, takes an experience. It takes a lived experience to change that perspective. And I believe that, while everyone agrees that empathy is important and we should have more of it, I think we really need to invest in those experiences. And these should be research-based, evidence-based, and delivered by trusted institutions and platforms, so that we can enable all to discover empathy within themselves. We cannot offer something that we don't have, we lack to begin with. So we need to start ourselves so that we can offer our empathy to others around us and expand it to all of humanity, beyond our traditional communities, to people who don't look and think like us, including our environment and the planet itself with all of its resources, which some traditions consider also other beings, such as mountains, the ocean, the sky. So we have a long journey ahead of us, and that's why we are doing these workshops. Designing for Empathy is just about that. So in this workshop, and in all the Designing for Empathy workshops, I would like to emphasize, in addition to learning about Black Lives Matter, why it is important within our context, we also would like to be mindful and explore within ourselves how we react to this type of information, and always be considerate of our own biases. And we can just do this in our own privacy. You don't have to share, but I'm inviting all of us to be mindful that whenever we're encountered with a new perspective or new information, how am I reacting to this? I think that's this articulation of this sort of being posed with a dilemma and having to react to it instantly is the beginning, the foundation of empathy, I think. And if we can better articulate this process, we can better design for these experiences. And in addition, for those who are in academia, museum studies programs, or museum professionals, we are also very interested in transferring these experiences. For example, it may be, and Monica will give us all the background about her particular experience, but imagine that we may have an experience that was developed for an art museum, what can we learn from that experience, the way we looked at something and engaged with ourselves and expanded our perspectives? Can we transfer it to an experience in an aquarium or a zoo or a children's museum? How would that look like? Because empathy is one thing. We just take it with us. So the more we notice and articulate, the many contexts for it, also allows us to really be more intentional about it, I think. And so in addition to expanding these experiences to other museum contexts, as we know, there's a museum about anything and everything under the sky, right? I mean, we have on all topics probably we can think of. So it could be good if we can make them all intentional about empathy. And then the next question is, how do we scale these experiences? How do we scale them up so that they are available in more and other new contexts beyond museums? Can we use performing arts? Can we art centers? Can we use libraries? Can we use national parks or children's parks, playgrounds, to incorporate some of these perspective-taking experiences that are intentionally designed into the space? Most importantly, of course, I think one of our goals should be to able to scale these conversations up to our businesses and corporations and institutions and our government and all the structure that we live in. So that's, I think, will help us build a culture of empathy ingrained in our society, in our world, hopefully. And finally, of course, in our everyday lives, as we go through our lives, how is this new information that we are going to experience today is going to affect us? Let's try to be mindful and try to articulate the things that we can do and we cannot do. And this is a safe space. I invite everyone to share things from their heart and not as a reaction or a judgment to what somebody else might have said. So we have trust in our little community here and then expand it to beyond. So thank you so much again for being here, and I'll leave the floor to Monica.
Before we go to Monica, Elif, thank you so much. And Monica, I promise I will introduce you officially in a moment, but I do want to offer a land acknowledgement. Elif, since I know you're in Washington, D.C., on behalf of one organization, we recognize the Nacotchtank, Atcostan, and Petaskwe people and their stolen ancestral land upon which the city of Washington, D.C. resides. And since I'm calling in from New York City, I would like to acknowledge that New York City is located in the ancestral Lenape homelands, and that we collectively recognize the long-standing significance of all of these lands for Indigenous nations past and present. So thank you very much for joining us. And with that said, I would like to officially welcome our guest, Monica O. Montgomery, Social Justice Curator and colleague extraordinaire, to lead us into a really thoughtful dialogue about teaching Black Lives Matter. Monica, thanks for being with us.
Thank you, Elise. Thank you, Greg. Hello to all participants, near, far, virtual, and every other method. It's so good to be here with you for this exchange about designing for and with empathy and teaching strategies for Black Lives Matter. I am going to attempt to share my screen, and I ask that you bear with me because that's always the first half of the battle. Let's see here. I just want to make sure we get to that first slide. And this is meant to be a dialogue, not just a monologue. And so I really am hoping that you all will have some juicy questions, some interesting comments, dare I say even an assertion, and interact and participate alongside the presentation that I am giving. Can everyone see the screen? It says Hear, Care, Act really big, thumbs up. Okay, great. So I'm Monica O. Montgomery, museum activist and bon vivant. I wear many hats, but I wear them all with pride and with a lot of gratitude for being positioned in a space where people want to hear what I have to say. And I don't just represent myself, I try to amplify the voices of BIPOC, Black, Indigenous persons of color as I speak. I am currently a social justice curator for the Smithsonian Arts and Industries Building, working on the Futures exhibition, which is opening in November. You're all invited. Yes, it is in real life, and it will be open November to July. I am also the co-founder and strategic director of Museum Hue. We are the premier advocacy organization advocating for people of color in art history, heritage, humanities, and beyond in museums. I do a fair amount of diversity, equity, anti-racism, and inclusion, consulting, strategy, statement crafting, working with museums, universities, and associations large and small. When I'm not doing all of that and trying to get a little sleep, I'm a graduate professor. I teach classes around museums and social justice and museums and community engagement at Georgetown, American, and Johns Hopkins University. Enough about me. Let's get into it. So this is an image of what I like to see and the flavor that I like to bring in community with others in museums. I am here for the culture, as a part of the culture, and for the community as a part of the community. And I have a deep-seated belief that museums must be in service to society. And that is the premise with which I operate, with which I consult, with which I teach, and that I curate, and that I try to attend museums that align with those values as a patron, as a visitor. So this is an image of an exhibit and a group of people gathered around a particular piece of art at the Weeksville Heritage Center in Brooklyn, New York, where I was a consulting social justice curator. I curated an exhibit for them called In Pursuit of Freedom Now, celebrating their 50-year anniversary and all that occurred on that historic site, where there are historic homes that remind us of the freedom seeking and the intentional Black community that was created at Weeksville as a place where people can escape from enslavement, find freedom, raise their families, get a bit of land, get the American dream in that era, but really a safe space for Black people and an intentionally planned community for them to live in. Still operating in Brooklyn, New York, and they were celebrating their 50th anniversary. And so I curated a contemporary art exhibit and a public history exhibit for this. And I figured in the opening, when we had the most people, when the most amount of critical mass was there, what would it look like to talk through the work with the artist? And thinking of empathy and thinking of social justice, which I see tied hand in hand, what would it look like for some of the presenting artists to have a chance to speak about their own work and how it connected okay. So, thank you. As I was saying, can everyone see that screen? It says for the culture, for the community. Okay, thank you for that. Let's hope there's no more glitches. So in essence, this is the kind of spaces I like to curate and create around empathy and social justice and togetherness. Go to the next slide. So maybe you're like, hey, Black Lives Matter. I've seen a lot in the newspapers. I've seen it in the media. I've seen the hashtag. What is this about? Black Lives Matter is a movement to activate social justice, specifically around Black people throughout the diaspora, looking at African Americans, Black folks in the UK and the EU, Caribbean, South American, Afro-Latino, Canadians, continental Africans, you name it. But what does it look like for futures that are safe, just, and free from harm, oppression, and violence? This image I found on Shutterstock is of George Floyd, who the world should know at this point. His birthday was posthumously celebrated, I believe yesterday or a few days ago. He would have turned 48. And the 1-year anniversary of his killing, it's painful, but it's familiar because so many Black bodies have been endangered and hurt and maimed, and it is not fair, and it will never be. And I'm someone that believes Black Lives Matter, and I feel that it is a movement that everyone can and should get behind, because we wouldn't want any person of any ethnicity, identity, culture, religion, etc., to be actively being killed and harmed and slain, and for the people doing that to legally get away with it. So the 1-year anniversary of George Floyd's killing this year, I celebrated by taking a day off and being mindful, consuming content related to his life and Black history in general, and working with a number of museum clients to help them craft statements of accountability, of saying that they stand with Black lives and saying the how and the why and the what they're going to do. If you're unfamiliar, these 3 persons are the co-founders of BLM. Elissa Garza, Opal Tometi, Patrice Cullors. Many of them have come out with books and done videos about their experience in this movement, going from, hashtag to today's international humanitarian movement, but really aiming to engage allies in the fighting of violence and brutality and racism and oppressions from all sides and facilitate liberation. And it's an intersectional movement, meaning it's not one thing, but many things together. So you may see Black Lives Matter protesters or advocates working on issues around mass incarceration or food justice or climate change or police brutality or intra-community violence or any number of things that are imperiling Black persons of the diaspora. So it has evolved. There are chapters. It is a decentralized movement where there is not just one leader or hero or monarch, but rather many people taking leadership roles. And while I am not officially a representative or a chapter member, I believe and align myself with the values that the organization holds and that spin-off movements have held relating to this. Thinking of values, I am someone that went to school for communication. And so I'm always wondering, what is the messaging and the values that institutions and organizations and nonprofits aim to get across? There are 13 official values upheld by the movement, which can be found on their website, but some that I wanted to highlight here. Number 1, empathy. The site states that they're committed to practicing empathy, engaging comrades with the intent to learn about and connect with their contacts. Loving engagement, globalism, collective values, where they say that all Black lives matter, regardless of actual or perceived sexual identity, gender expression, economic status, ability, disability, religious beliefs, geography, disbeliefs, immigration, or location. And being intergenerational, which is another great value undergirding empathy, that people young and old, all ages, walks of life, abilities can show up with the capacity to lead and to learn. And as I mentioned, working to combat systems of oppression intersectionally, right? All the isms, right? The stereotypes, the exclusion, the white supremacy, the white gaze, the silencing, the violence. And I should also note that Black lives matter, and those who believe in those tenets, it celebrates the living, it celebrates the lives, the joy, the times where we can gather together and it's not a wake or a funeral or a mourning, right? How do we live and how do we preserve and ensure the integrity of our living? And that is the counterpoint to the sorrow, right? Is the strength of what do we do to affirm ourselves and those who are of color like us and allies who want to engage in this work. I want to just read a little something for those that are, still trying to be on the learning curve of empathy of like, well, I've seen things on the news and I'm not quite sure, and this movement isn't for me, or I don't feel qualified to speak because maybe I am, white and or Asian and or, was other, right? I'm not Black, so I can't say much. Some people lead institutions and they lead institutions with those values of neutrality, which we know is often a myth. And oftentimes people personally feel overwhelmed to get involved. Certainly you have to do what is best for yourself and your person and caring for yourself in the midst of social justice movements, but just realizing kind of the deep-seated need and urgency. And so there are many Black people who are walking around with centuries of fear and anger and sadness and despair in our blood memory, in our DNA, inheriting the pain and the consequence of hundreds of years of enslavement and bondage, of oppression, of segregation, of redlining and any other kind of marginalization you can imagine. And we carry it and it's heavy. So oftentimes Black persons and institutions that represent them will use art, poetry, music, dance, literature, spirituality, meditation to channel these feelings, to reconcile, the rage with the yearning for liberation, and to kind of process the venting about the injustice of this world. But simultaneously, many Black people walk around with centuries of survival and strength and resilience in their bones and their DNA, and fortitude and genius to overcome everything that is thrown at us, and learning that we have to get creative, we have to get strategic, we have to get innovative to stay alive, to thrive, to evolve, to free ourselves from bondage and violence, and use our brilliance to empathize with those who could uplift our situation and help our struggle in dignity and basic human rights. So when we think about Black lives, oftentimes people think about the protests in the streets, and that is a major component, that direct action, whether it is a sit-in or a die-in, or a series of protests near government buildings, municipal spaces, shutting down traffic, wearing coordinated outfits, be that hoodies or black and yellow Black Lives Matter t-shirts, or putting your hands up, or using hashtags online. All of those are methods and devices, thinking of protests as a pivot from the status quo, demanding attention and stopping the normal flow of the world of society to call attention to this cause. Many other movements have used these strategies, and continue to with great success. And some of the success that the Black Lives Matter movement has experienced, I do want to note. First off, there's been so many protests, I could never comprehensively list them all. But even if we think back before these modern moments of the summer of 2020 and the racial uprising there's the civil rights marches. There's, student marches and walkouts, Million Man March, Million Women March, Million Kids March. Some would say the Women's March is aligned with certain values of Black lives. Justice or Else March, Million Hoodies March. So many grassroots organizations have and continue to march and protest and use direct action. But I will say some points of achievement that this has accomplished from what I have seen and gleaned from the news and other sources. Charges were filed and judgment was made on Officer Derek Chauvin, who was the main officer who put George Floyd in a chokehold and rallied his other officers to engage in his killing. Within 10 days of the George Floyd protests, Minneapolis banned the use of chokeholds officially through their law enforcement. There have been many kind of know your rights camps and other organizations that come together to educate the public about what they can do and what they need to know, and engaging with police and engaging in a system where they're advocating. And many different cities have put in legislation for their city, even some states. But police brutality being captured on cameras and being reported is having more of an effect towards justice and reckoning, as well as, if you consider this a win, many monuments, Confederate and otherwise, have come down that serve to denigrate and intimidate Black people for generations. So there is traction. There is a sense of momentum in this movement. And whether you believe or not or participate or not, things are happening and the world is shifting, and we have to take notice of that and be mindful of that. Speaking of museums and things coming to our front door as museum stewards and practitioners, I like the word steward because I feel that everyone who works in museums or for them or around them is really stewarding a resource for the public to enjoy. There's been a greater call for accountability and transparency in museums, and we see museums often being called out and called to task for the things they do and the things they don't do, for the times they get it right and the times they get it wrong, and often for their internal practices. And that's another lecture for another day. But please know that many of the Black Lives Matter protests have spurred on a general awakening and a revolution in cultural institutions and corporations and otherwise. And many institutions, corporations, and nonprofits have publicly aligned themselves with Black Lives Matter or standing in solidarity. And while those words are great, those words have to be followed by the actions and the empathy that is sought after. I want to mention a theory that I use in my approach to designing with empathy museum experiences and any kind of museum engagements, and it's the theory of community care. Community care is a theory that exists in the world, but I define it this way, and I've done talks with Museum Next, I've written book chapters, all of these things to try to canonize it. So hopefully folks will remember. So community care, looking at an architecture of practice to honor our humanity, centering advocacy, empathy, and social responsibility, how we embrace our visitors and ourselves, and how ultimately museums must be and need to be and will be and are currently in service to society. So looking at that theory as a lens for designing with empathy. I think that, and you're going to see a lot of pictures of me because I have the rights to use them, and I have a lot of museum friends around the world. These are some of my buddies in the UK. There's an organization there called Museum Detox, similar to Museum Hue. They advocate for persons of color. They call it BAME, Black, Asian, Minority, and Ethnic, and doing that work of equity and parity. So they were visiting, or I might have been visiting them, but we got together, took this beautiful picture. So thinking of community care, right? What does that mean? What does that look like? How welcoming and belonging, which is another term that's being bandied about that I actually like, coming out of the world of diversity and inclusion, is bringing people in, right? So empathy, welcoming, belonging, social justice, some of these terms are synonymous. Some of them are, dovetailing one another, but leading to these similar ends, right? How can we envision a museum as a socially responsive space that expands on community care, as a place for people to convene and organize and collaborate and contextualize what's happening in the world? How can museums extend themselves even beyond what they're currently doing to partner with community members, using their space or their platform or their influence as a launch pad for folks to discover common threads? And when I say more than they're already doing, I believe my approach to community engagement and museum outreach is about being relational and not transactional. So when we think of museums, oftentimes will celebrate an ethnic heritage month, be it Hispanic Heritage Month, which I believe is currently happening or just wrapping up, or AAPI, Asian American Heritage Month, Black History Month. Oftentimes that's when museum leadership gets really concerned with their community and with who's out there and the empathy that it takes to relate to them, because oftentimes community members in the near neighborhoods of the museum look very different than the museum staff and leadership and board. So they get concerned with issues about representation and getting people in the door and getting them to see that we're doing it for them. But that can be perceived as transactional, a one-time, we come around, come see the museum, we're going to give you artist talk, we're going to let you use the space for free, and then we don't do it again until next year. But how can we shift that paradigm to museums being more relational, caring about building goodwill, moving at the speed of trust, looking at what is it like to engage a community or many year round, in season and out, and how that can transform practice. And then museums ultimately, through this lens of community care, that are honoring and humanizing the social justice and the lived experience and concerns of their audiences, visitors, and stakeholders. This is just more about Black lives, but just realizing, I'm just kind of recapping, it is a movement for all to engage in. If there are other social justice issues you care about, guaranteed they probably intersect with Black lives in some way, or at least honor the existence of this movement. I see a lot of churches now and other spaces having Black Lives Matter signs up on their premises. I even see homes in very well-heeled neighborhoods, having flags and different things to kind of signal the values of the residents in that home. And I think that is a good move. And I think again, it has to go beyond the statements to the actions. If we're wondering for a bit of data, our friends at Museum Next, they're a prominent museum organization hosting conferences and articles and white papers and case studies and undergirding kind of the knowledge commons of the museum sector. They did a survey back in 2017 that I think is, again, this lens of social justice. They asked visitors, do you think you'd be more likely to visit a museum that took a stand on issues that matters to you, AKA social justice, AKA fostering empathy? And many, 50% at least, said yes. And also, do they feel they'd be more or less relevant for a museum that talks about social issues? And many said more relevant. And if that's what was happening, 4 or 5 years ago, and my math might be around 6 or 7 years ago, then we can only imagine what's happening now through pandemic and uprisings and beyond. So I want to talk about frameworks that I use and that are used in the world, thinking about visitors, thinking about designing something, experience design, whether that's an exhibit or an event or a festival or just a small, kind of smaller discrete experience. What does it look like to use frameworks that exist, create your own, and have these various approaches to the visitor's needs and dare I say, their rights? And all these images are taken by an artist friend, Mr. William Ellis. I want to signal boost his work. So that's another picture of me. Don't be surprised. This is when I was leading a public program for a children's museum, the Children's Museum of Manhattan, to be exact. And I was traveling an exhibit all about Upstanders, people that kind of stand up, speak up, and act up for what is right, for social justice. And so as someone that is a self-proclaimed social justice curator, no, I don't have a degree in it, but yes, I live it, I walk it, I talk it, I embody it. I think that my role is to be a storyteller, is to be a solutionary and a signal booster, uplifting what's wrong, what's right, and what needs remedy. Remedy is my new favorite word. It just has such a poetry to it. So when thinking about what's wrong, what's right, and what needs remedy, what is within that sphere of social justice, and how can one curate around that? Any social justice curator, any experienced designer, any empathetic person can and should relate, right? So how do we, myself and others, interrogate issues and isms? All the isms you could think of, those are the ones I mean. Racism, sexism, all of that. How does that get discussed and discovered and problematized and nuanced? How can we inspire action in our audiences and critical thinking? So the inspiration to go and do, and the understanding of what is happening and the broader scope of things. How do we illuminate hidden histories? How do we envision, and I took artistic license, I know it's with an E, but I was on a I train here. How do we envision expanded narratives? How do we intersect with current events? How can we identify the causes we care about, the causes that our audiences care about, the causes that our world cares about? Oftentimes people look to the media for this, but I guarantee you there are many other causes and issues and current events bubbling up that haven't made it in the news yet. For example, and it is making it in the news now, many of the world was fascinated and concerned with the disappearance of a young Caucasian woman named Gabby Petito. And while it is tragic that she, was kidnapped, captured, hasn't been found, and there's a lot of mysteries regarding the circumstances, there are many BIPOC persons that go missing and are kidnapped and captured on a regular basis, most notably Native American and First Nations and Indigenous women have been complaining of this. Oftentimes there are African Americans that go missing and the families aren't able to get the media coverage that is needed for national searches and finding those persons. There's a foundation called the Black and Missing Foundation that specializes in signal boosting these stories. So that while there was the context of the larger media story, the story within a story may not have bubbled up to the forefront, but it's still very much on the hearts and minds of visitors of color who say, wow, I'm sorry that this person is missing, but what about all the people I know who are missing or slain, and where is justice for them? How do we imagine a better world? I have a friend named Paige Danziger, and she runs and continues to do virtually a museum called Better World Museum. And I love the premise of it. And it's all about engagement and art making together. But really, what does it look like to imagine a better world and try to manifest that? How can social justice curators ignite change making and partnerships with the communities that are near us and those that we care about and those that reach out to us? How do we illustrate origin stories? How do we increase audiences' participation? How do we incubate liberation? That's a very hot button word, but ultimately the kind of freedom and the justice for all things, beings, and people. How do we incite feedback and critique and welcome that? How do we include public scholarship, maybe things that are not coming from academia, maybe community generated scholarship or first voice and oral histories from source communities? How do we weave all of that into an exhibit experience that is undergirding empathy and empathetic reactions? How do we incorporate resistance? How do we initiate conversations, community curation, and incline towards a tipping point? All that and more is the job and the role of social justice curation, and dare I say, a person who is designing for and with empathy. I also think there's some guiding questions that we should ask ourselves when designing experiences. And these are some of what I ask myself when I'm doing anything. And I will say I've curated over 50 social justice exhibits and festivals around a number of topics, Black lives being just one of them. I've done things around the school to prison pipeline, climate change, feminism, Indigenous lands and anti-fracking movements. You name it. I've tried to tackle it with institutions that are welcoming and hosting these experiences. And I think there is merit to that. I think it is worthy work. And while it is extremely hard and not as well sought after as maybe an arts for art's sake exhibit or history for history's sake, I'm starting to see through lines radiate out into mainstream museum practice. And I'm excited about that. And I feel like when I first started talking in, what was it, 2014 about museums and social justice, there were a lot of kind of quizzical looks and cross eyes and like, yeah, sounds good, but no one's ever going to go for it. No one will fund it. But now all of this pedagogy is becoming more mainstream. So thinking of these guiding questions, how do we purposely imbue an experience that's meaningful, multifaceted, affirming and critiquing, personal, right, and public? It has to work for the one and for the many, relevant and resonant. So what is timely and what is catching your heartstrings, emotional and enriching, compelling and creative. And then also I asked myself, what will make this experience memorable? And no, I hate to say it's not usually just jazzy label text, but usually there is an interactive of some sort, or something happening, or a performance, or a staged artistic intervention that can bring experiences alive, where there's capacity to do so. What do you, we want our visitors to feel? It's one thing to say, like, we're going to get you feeling and caring and knowing, but can you take them on a journey of empathy? And what does that journey map look like? And how do you give them space to grieve and grow, to laugh and cry, to have reflection, and to engage others when they are ready? And all of that takes a lot of intention and kind of pre-built in mindfulness, and understanding of the ultimate goal. And certainly visitors, right? Everyday people like you and me won't always get out of an experience what you're hoping, but you can try, and you can certainly do great evaluation, front end, during, and back end, pre, post summative, to understand what they did get out of it and what they were feeling. And ultimately, I think the process of empathy, I define empathy kind of poetically, as I do most things. I define empathy as mining compassion across the difference. Mining compassion across the difference. What does it look like to dig deep, to understand, to see, here is what is other, here's what is different, but here I can draw it to myself and empathize with it and have the same level of care and urgency and consideration that I would my own causes. So again, walking a mile in someone else's shoes, all of those things to me invoke and inspire empathy. And sometimes empathy requires pushing people out of their comfort zone. Most often it does, because if someone wasn't thinking about an issue and now you're presenting it to them in a way that is compelling, creative, emotional, enriching, etc., you have to get them understanding and on the same page that this is something that is important. This is an issue that needs addressing. And dare I say, you should bring it to your attention, get involved, and kind of hear, care, act, my three tenets around that. So there's so much, again, in the building of these experiences. I'm gonna keep going because I know I have a lot of content and I want to honor the time for us to dialogue and ask questions, as well as a little video to share of an experience that I curated around Black Lives Matter, so you can see all that was imbued there. But also just thinking about visitor feelings, right? Museums engender a range of emotions, and these are some of them that can come up. It's the meaning making, the social connecting, the wonder, the understanding, the yearning, the beauty, the enlightenment, the awe, the inspiration. All of that can bubble up, and you have to be ready for that. Many exhibits I've curated around Black Lives Matter, I make sure to put boxes of tissues everywhere in the gallery. It's a small thing, but it helps for those that have intense emotions and extreme reactions. And certainly telling people, like, here is a space for respite and reflection, and here is a space for aromatherapy or whatever else you're trying to put in, so you can let people know how they can care for themselves as they're going through. There are a few frameworks that I'll just signal boost and mention about visitor bill of rights, visitor rights, how we need to treat our visitors. And I think they're really interesting. And these, again, not an exhaustive list. I'm just going to reference three. A dear colleague and great brilliant thinker, Seema Rao of Brilliant Idea Studios, who is working as a leader in the museum in Cleveland, she blogged about this, and I particularly liked it. This is an excerpted version of what visitors have a right to do, right? To wander, to feel smart, to demand not to be made to feel stupid, to be near, to go backwards, miss the tour, take the tour, etc. But I like how at the end, she mentions they have a right to feel trusted. And trust, again, empathy, trust, all of these deep emotions is a really interesting tenet to explore. When most people think of a museum experience, they may not think of trust, or they may think the audience member trusts the museum to be an authoritative voice and disseminate information. But what else is that trust look like, and how is trust made a two-way street? This is done by Judy, I believe her name is Judy Rand, forgive me for not citing her at the bottom, the Visitor Bill of Rights, and she names many: comfort, orientation, welcoming and belonging, enjoyment, socializing, and respect, right? Under respect, visitors want to feel accepted at their own level of knowledge and interest. They don't want exhibits, labels, or staff to exclude them, patronize them, or make them feel unintelligent. So I'm seeing some relations to some of SEMA's Bill of Rights. And then under welcoming and belonging, just to note that friendly staff make visitors feel more at ease. If visitors see themselves represented in exhibits and programs and on the staff, they'll feel more like they belong. So to that welcoming and belonging tenet. Additionally, oh, there's her name, sorry, Judy Rand. Communication, learning, choice and control, challenge and confidence, revitalization. So all of these are things that museum studies students are often studying. This list was created probably over 20 to 25 years ago, but it's still very relevant to our modern day museology and exhibit craft and curation, and how we need to plan for our visitors and not just throw content at them. And lastly, I want to reference Elissa Olenski. She, again, another brilliant radical museologist, change maker, and speaker of truth to power. I believe she segued out of the museum sector, but still reference her hierarchy of needs and visitor needs. And so at the bottom is accessibility and safety needs. And accessibility is such an important part of any museum experience, making sure it is designed intentionally for people with many different abilities, disabilities, or otherly abled, depending on the terminology you use. Am I safe here? Am I welcome? Can I experience and learn this place? Then we go up, physiological needs: bathroom, Wi-Fi, can I charge my phone? How can I sit here? When do you close? Then we get into the psychological needs of kind of, what is this place? How do I navigate here? What will I learn? Higher up, what am I learning? How does the concepts connect to something I've seen before? Trying to extract that. Highest psychological, does this affect my life? How can I take action on this? That's where I think the empathy sweet spot can come in when you're designing an experience. How do you get someone from the bottom of getting them in the door to that type highest psychological need? And then the self-actualization, which many visitors might be experiencing and we just don't know. And the only way to tell is to evaluate and keep in good contact with your visitors. But how will this change my perspective on life? Imagine a visitor just asking that. You're just walking by and you're like, yes, that's what I wanted you to experience. So all of these are different frameworks for designing with empathy and social justice curation. I want to take a break. I'm monologuing, which I promise not to do. Feel free to pop in the chat box. What privileges do you hold? And what causes and crises do you care about? Because I'd like to do a little experience at the end where one lucky volunteer will say what cause they care about and think about how they can create an empathetic museum or other experience around that. So I'm going to keep rolling, but feel free to type in, what privileges do you hold? What causes and crises do you care about? And this is a quote from an activist, Blair Imani. Sometimes privilege looks like being able to ignore a crisis that others are dying from. And that, again, is a definite need, clear and present, for empathy. While you're typing in the chat, I want to help you think through how you might leverage empathy on the causes you care about. I'm not here to force anyone to adopt a stance for Black lives, but everyone, I guarantee, has something that's keeping them up at night, something they care about, something they want to advocate for, something they think, you know what, this is wrong, it needs to be righted. What is that thing? So again, you're thinking and typing that in the chat, but how you can leverage the spheres of influence and the soft power to enact empathy. As an individual, you can enact empathy. If you lead and steward an organization, you can enact empathy. And then how to literally get people knowing about what the empathy is needed for, how to boost that awareness around the pressing issue or the current event. So think about it, right? What do you hold the keys to? Who do you have the attention of? What do you have expertise in? What do you have the funding and patronage for or of? How can you create, research, or present around? How can you garner the support? How can you work and volunteer? Are you in a position of authority from your lived experience or otherwise, or just because you are in a position of authority? How can you invoke and speak the names and elevate the needs of? And why do you need social justice? Why does this issue need empathy? All of those are things to consider as you're popping your cause, ideas, and privilege in the chat. Temperature check. This is a lot of content, heavy as it is. So again, hopefully you're taking it all in. You might want a snack. Maybe you're learning something new, ready to dive deeper. If you have a question, I will ask that you put it in the chat and I'll address all questions at the end. But I do want to be mindful and empathetic towards the heavy amounts of content coming towards you. But now we're going to get to the fun stuff, the approach that I've developed about Hear, Care, Act, and an example of this in the world. So again, all images courtesy of my friend William Ellis. Here, Caring, Acting, talking about that, the process and some of what goes into that. The Movement is Rising exhibit, which I have a great video around, which was done at the Brooklyn Museum back in, oh, I'm getting old, 2017, I think. All the 20s are starting to run together. It's just pre-pandemic and post, but I'm sure you understand. And then examples of other museums that are doing amazing work around Black lives, and then we can kind of crowdsource and talk together what you've come up with for your own idea for empathy. So once upon a time, I created a mobile social justice museum called the Museum of Impact, inspiring action, exploring art, activism, self, and society. That was our official mission. And while this work was amazing and intense and exhausting, and the blood, sweat, and tears, and a lot of highs and some lows, I was excited to operate this venture for 5 years and to work through the lens of social justice curation, bringing these empathetic, emotionally resonant experiences to everyone, to all spaces that would have us, that looked like parks, that looked like university student activity centers. We went to recreation centers. We went to homeless shelters. We went to schools. We would frequently pop up in parking lots. So it was an indoor, outdoor, wild and wavy time of trying to create empathetic, emotionally resonant experiences for people that cared about a variety of causes. I've since sunsetted this organization. It'll be hard to find a trace of it online, although there may be some articles and citations, but it was an amazing start for me to kind of dip my toe from going from being a theorist of, I think this will work and here's how I want to approach it, to a practitioner and getting that experience under my belt. Some pop-ups, we had 10 people come, some 100, some several thousand. And so it was, again, a defining pinnacle in my career, just kind of getting this off the ground. And this was a concept I thought of, I self-funded, and I operated until I couldn't. But I really appreciate just the deep-seated knowledge that was drawn from myself and my collaborators of how to engage audiences around empathy. The exhibit that I'm going to show the video of is called The Movement is Rising. It launched in 2015 initially, and then we did the Brooklyn Museum in 2017. This particular exhibit, we had several popped up at 25 schools, community centers, etc., activating empathy, righteous indignation, connecting visitors to human rights and injustices perpetrated against people of color and Black lives writ large. So I'm going to stop sharing this. I can take a moment for questions, or I can show the video. What would you all prefer? Greg, lead me. Do people want to ask questions in this moment? Okay, we're going to jump into the video. Okay, bear with me as I open another screen. Wait a second. Sorry, talk amongst yourselves. I'm still trying to get this video up. Okay, hold on one second. And definitely pop your questions in the chat as well, if need be, because, okay, stop, come back. Here we go. I think, am I sharing? Can you all see that video? Yes, no? Okay, let me try again. Let's see. I'm going to share screen. If only there were an AV person in my head. Okay, this might work. Can you all see this? Yes? No? Oh. Oh. Can you hear that?
Hi, my name is Monica Montgomery. I'm the founding director and curator of
We can hear it, but we cannot see it.
Okay. Sorry. Okay. We'll try that again. And Greg, you were telling me before, there is a way to do this well with the optimizing of video. Okay, I'm going to say optimize video clip, share sound. I'm going to go back to this. Can you all see a screen that says movement is rising? And now I can't see you, so I'm gonna have to have someone say it aloud.
Yes, we see this. Yes, movement is
Okay.
rising. Hashtag movement is rising. Yes.
Okay, great. I'm gonna try to play it again because I've lost your faces, but technology ideally. Okay, let's do this full screen and here we go.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, my name is Monica Montgomery, and I'm the founding director and curator of the Museum of Impact, the world's first mobile social justice museum. We're popping up at the Brooklyn Museum for First Saturdays, interpreting the Black radical tradition and Black Lives Matter. The Black radical tradition has such deep roots and foundations in the core of who we are as people of color, and I wanted to highlight all that's come before us that's led up to this moment in time. This is a watershed moment for civil rights, for human rights, and we just believe that there are so many activists and advocates and thinkers and public intellectuals that need to be in the public consciousness and need to have a light shined on them, and so we're here to do that work tonight. One piece that I really have a lot of respect for and really calls to me is The Movement is Rising, which is about the miscarriages of justice in this country and showing how activism is actively combating that. Orange is the New Black is a piece that was recently added to our collection, and it's showcasing the prison culture and school to prison pipeline, and generally just showing how our bodies are always in danger in this country, and thinking about what we can do to change that.
Wonderful thing that Sandra Bland did before she died was recorded 29 videos. It talks about her personal struggles with depression. It talks about her anger, her angst, her frustration at the lack of willingness of Americans to actually honor Black lives.
The impact of being in the Brooklyn Museum means that more people will know about the importance of this movement. Black Lives Matter doesn't just become important when someone's killed. It's all the times in between where we're working for liberation and futures that are safe and free. I just want to encourage everyone to be an upstander and not a bystander, and find ways that they can get involved with making our society a better place.
All right, this video was lagging a bit. I'm going to stop it there. And I'd love to hear any feedback you have of what you saw, what you think resonated, where empathy was baked in. And thank you for your patience with the video.
Monica, thank you so much for sharing the video. And I think it would also be helpful if it's possible for you to share the link with us in the chat so we can also watch it later. And because there was some problems in my on my end, so it was getting cut off. So it would be good to maybe watch it later. But from my I wish I were there, to be honest. And this like Museum of Impact idea is such a so it is still going on, right? I mean, is this still no? This is an amazing concept, I think.
I had to shut it down. I just couldn't afford and get the funding I needed, but we did it for 5 years, and it could come back one day.
Yes, I hope so. I hope so. This is such an amazing concept, and it just brings, any space to life, I think. And especially museums can be really good platforms for that, because they have the space, right? They're readily available, that we can just use the space for this type of knowledge sharing, experience sharing, collective experience, and it just looked so lively. I have a question, did you have a way to follow up with people or individuals, what were their reflections, and were people inspired to take action after it?
That's a great question. So it was my dear hope that one day we could raise the funds needed to get like a proper evaluation done. But we did ask people to check in with us on our social media. And so we use the hashtag Movement is Rising, as well as some of our other social media platforms to communicate, and asking people what they would do after they saw. Some people did follow up. Sometimes I would see someone on the street and they're like, oh, like you're the curator who did that thing. And ever since then, I've been, watching more news or thinking about ways to give back or how I can, divert or divest, right, from certain institutions and resources. So I think it has anecdotally been documented. I wasn't with that 4,000 person event and my scant staff of volunteers and friends. I wasn't able to evaluate that space, but in other spaces we did do more formal evaluation, especially because when we had the institutional support of certain universities, we were able to dive in. Most people just felt like they had their awareness lifted and that they came out of feeling frozen, right? Feeling scared, feeling like, oh, there's nothing I can do, or, this is not my concern, or I'm not qualified to speak. I feel like it shifted in that way. I didn't get any reports that people like went and started their own, organizations or led a protest, but I'm sure many of them did, if we were to follow up 5 years later.
That's amazing. And, I'm just so inspired by this work, the first thing that comes to my mind, and that's what my initiative is hoping to achieve, through our work, through our collective efforts. We really need to make these efforts sustainable. I mean, this is what our world needs, and we need to learn from each other and make these, efforts sustainable, because we need more of them everywhere, in different unexpected places, that people just encounter them, and then that experience makes people question them, interrupting their daily routines almost, and I just love this, just going out and just being, like it's just like explosion of life. I just loved it. And the other thing that I'm gonna shut up after this, but the other thing that I was really inspired is that what you said earlier, what needs remedy, and then you were talking about, you know, the qualities of the space. And I think what this Museum of Impact achieves is through proximity, by bringing the other, whatever we call the other, in close proximity to the audience, to the visitors. And proximity is, I think, so essential, because we can hear these things on the radio, we can see these events on the news or social media. It is nothing really replaces a lived experience that you're in the same space with whatever is going on. And I was working on the summit program, which you will all receive a copy when, you know, hopefully soon it will be ready. But, you know, these are the alchemy of empathy ingredients. And I was hoping that we can all like fill out these ingredients, because such as proximity, such as, you know, collective sharing, lived experience, like just a few that just came to my mind after watching the video. But I think, you know, these are just like the water drops, you know, they are not just like pieces of a puzzle. They don't have edges and corners. They live within itself. You know, like the proximity and storytelling and, you know, collective experience, it's one thing. You cannot really separate it. So that's, I think, to me, the alchemy of that space that you have created. So I'm hoping that, you know, collectively we can really like become intentional and sort of dissect those, and that doesn't sound very nice, but, you know, like really examine and articulate what is really happening, what is taking place. Thank you.
Monica, this is Michelle. And I think one of the challenges that we have as an organization is that we are in the space itself is a barrier. We are in a former, we're in a nature preserve that is a former plantation space. And until recently, like until about a year or two ago, it was called the Latta Plantation Nature Preserve, and there is a plantation home. And so just even entering the space is something that that people have to overcome to come to our facility. And so we've been really trying to work very hard on making that less of a barrier. And I'm sure that museums have some of those same challenges, and I'd just be curious to know what is your advice for overcoming those kinds of challenges?
For overcoming a space challenge? Can you say the question again?
So overcoming kind of the stigma of your space, and having people who you want to come and experience these experiences want to come in.
Right. I mean, I will say, I think plantations, especially in places that call themselves plantations, are going to have a fraught relationship with the general public in these days and times, with the way the society is moving and how people think. I think there's a case for rebranding and taking the name plantation out of your name, and or inviting the public in to interrogate the checkered past, right, of that space, and
well,
how you're working.
We did do that. We changed the name to Latta Nature Preserve, and but it's still, you know, it's still like the history of this, you know, it's been called the other thing for a really long time. But inviting people in is like you said, fraught with peril.
Yeah, let's talk offline potentially of what can be done. Yeah, any other thoughts to the video? And I had a little more to share about the Hear Care Act, and then we could jump back into a discussion. Any other thoughts? Okay, I will, bear with me, attempt to share screen again. It's always a crapshoot. Hold on. Why? Okay, let me try this again. Okay, of course you're seeing all my emails. Okay, so yeah, Museum of Impact did all the things for a solid 5 years. The process that we engaged in, myself, other team members, curators that work with us, but that I kind of, you know, encapsulated here is what I call the symmetry of concern: hearing, caring, and act, right? So how do you hear, care, and act about something as you are experiencing it, once you've seen it, after you've seen it? And hearing, can look like deep listening, fostering empathy. Caring, how do you kind of build equity and activate yourself and your community to care, to give a damn, as people say? And then action, what sparks that action? Some of the process we use and the devices we use is kind of counter narrative, inviting people to write and craft their own stories. I'm a former elementary school teacher and now a college professor, and through all of those experiences, writing has been essential. And people often have this latent desire to express themselves. Not everyone's a public speaker, not everyone wants to get up in front of a lot, but just that mindfulness and that process of writing and jotting it down. We oftentimes would invite people to write a letter. We would mail it back to them, in a month's time. And that's pretty standard, I think. A lot of museums do that, but we wanted people to kind of document and archive that moment in time and tell their story or share their thoughts in some way that is meaningful. We also invite them to color, because who doesn't love color? Activists themselves were invited to engage with us, and those that we were able to get in touch with, we would oftentimes have town halls and let the subject matter experts and speakers speak to the people directly and just be there as a facilitator and a holder of space. The activists you see here, Sherelle Brown, Garcia, Carmen, I believe Carmen Garcia, and Zeli Imani. And so these are activists that have all now, kind of become legends in their own right at this time. They were just kind of taking off, but we had whole weeks of town halls. And again, if the money were there, I would have loved to have like AV documenting copiously, graphic note takers, all that. But at the time, we just tweeted it on social media and invited people to keep coming. And people found a lot of resonance in that, because a lot of people were like, hey, I know the issues, I feel the empathy, what can I do? What am I advised to do? So we at Museum of Impact never wanted to be prescriptive and say, here are the steps you take to be a true ally, but rather invite people who are on the front lines of that work who could speak to that. And then just getting the audience feedback and having lots of community partners. As you saw, there was a member of my sorority, Sigma Gamma Rho Sorority Incorporated, Dr. Deidre Cooper Owens, who spoke at that event. And I partnered with other sororities and fraternities, civic groups, churches, educational groups, you name it. If there's a group and they wanted to do something meaningful, it's like, hey, come get involved, come volunteer, come table at our event, share your information. How can we just have a commons where everyone's coming together? And of course, the kiddos as well. I saw a question, I think, from Joan about this experience of putting Post-its on things, and simply enough, we would have a question prompt, we would have a piece of art, we'd say, put your thoughts right on the art. It was a reproduced piece of art, this wasn't an original, and get people just kind of looking and witnessing one another in a gallery wall space and what we each think, and continuing to add to that. We did get a good amount of documentation and pictures of those. So I feel like the framework of designing with empathy and for empathy is provocation and education. The experiences weren't meant to just be educative and again, prescriptive of like, here is what we know, here's what you should do, but really a provocation. Here is a juicy, open-ended, question, and we seek your comments, or here is what we believe, what do you believe? So it's a yes and approach. And the way that, I like this quote about learning, because again, thinking of informal learning and kind of pro-social, positive social relationships, all of that comes together in this experience. So we're not going to sit you down at a table, but rather you're going to learn passively and on your own means and in your own way. So hearing is that deep listening, the decentering of self to understand others. How can we walk around oftentimes thinking about ourselves and our concerns? How can we put that down momentarily and understand and pick up the mile in your shoes approach, which is how can I empathize with others and their needs? The caring, how and where do we cultivate empathy and advocate in that way, and kind of get ourselves out of this state of forced apathy, or even worse, kind of the numbingness that oftentimes we have to do just to function and get through the day. Bad things happen, we see it on the news, we hear it from our friends, it's terrible, we take a moment, think, and then we have to get back to our normal standard. And in the process of kind of subduing our urges to be emotional and empathetic, oftentimes it's hard to get back in that framework, but we try to actively get people thinking like that. We brought in often, performers, counselors to help people try to activate their caring again. And then the action. What is the action you can take? What do you want to take? How do you need help with that? How can you affirm the current movement and commemorate the lives lost and the lessons learned and the justice hard won? And then think about other facets of movement work you may want to engage in or start or join. Here, caring acting is inspiring people to envision their role in championing change, right? Finding intersectionality between my lived experience and your lived experience and our experience and the social issues of the day. And a term we use is called transforming from bystanders to upstanders. So I did a TEDx talk called How to Be an Upstander, which was all about my journey to creating Museum of Impact. And that was terminology that made people feel engaged and empowered, and it worked well. More about hearing. This is an image from the NAACP. They used to raise a flag when a person was lynched, and that practice, in the modern Black Lives Matter context, has continued with many artists continuing to create this flag and raise it when people are killed. So what does it look like to raise that consciousness? Again, listen deeply, unpack the issues, listen to the voices and the words of those most affected. And I'll a little later, shortly, get into an activity about that. Discuss and discover feelings, hopes, dreams, and decipher multiple meanings. I'm just gonna kind of keep going, and I'll happily share these slides with you, Elif and Greg. Caring, cultivating empathy and advocacy and artivism. This image is of the Africa Center. They're kind of at the top end of Museum Mile in the Upper East Side of New York. They are both an incubator and think tank, as well as a cultural space for performance and visual art. And they took the exterior of their building, which is, pretty beautiful architectural marvel, these geometric windows, to put up a kind of window mural of the statement, Black Lives Matter, along with many of the people in the American context that have been slain within it. They also did a day of dedication, and they took 45 minutes to read the names of many of the people known and unknown within that movement. Speaking up, acting, right? Affirming Black lives, the dignity, making your values visible. So I have a few, and I'm sorry, I'm flying through because I'm like, wow, it's 11:16. A few examples of many of these. So there was an artist named Shirin Barji, and she, I believe this was 2018, she took the last words of many of the persons, Black persons who were killed and slain, and made kind of art and memes out of it and shared this broadly on the internet. So thinking of Michael Brown's last word and Trayvon Martin's last words, and how the pathos of that, right, and the ethos of that can help inspire empathy. The final statements with these stark Black backgrounds, kind of line drawings, it gives this haunting effect. And so oftentimes we would show this sort of art with permission from the artist to get people thinking about the actual, I call them martyrs, who were slain. Story harvesting, right? So what does it look like to just take an excerpt of what someone is saying on social media or otherwise, share that broadly and have conversation around it? Darnella Frazier was the young woman who filmed the killing of George Floyd and was haunted by it. I believe she was in high school at the time. And she talks about what it was like, right? She was 17 when it happened, and just walking down the streets, the corner store, wasn't prepared to see what she saw. It changed her, how she viewed life, made her realize how dangerous the world is, and she was ultimately threatened in many ways, bodily harm and otherwise, from people who didn't want her testimony to get out, but it did, and it did change the fate of the case. So these sorts of things, hearing from people, activists, martyrs, mothers of the movement, others, I feel like there's a lot of currency in that, and invoking empathy. At one time, we were commissioned to do murals at Museum of Impact, and this is one of the murals we did. I had a lot of sympathy and empathy for the mothers of the movement. And you see a mural of them. It's called Every Mother's Mural at the top. This is done in Newark, in an urban area, in a neighborhood that had a lot of gun violence. And so we juxtaposed local mothers who had their children killed either by police brutality or intra-community violence, as well as the mothers of the national figures, Trayvon's mom, Sandra Bland's mom, etc., and kind of having this be a space, almost like a, I don't want to say a memorial because that is heavy and imbued with a lot of meaning, but something that people can resonate with. A lot of people did come up and put flowers at the foot of this, and still do. It still stands. And we did some activations in terms of community engagement. We invited Gun Violence Task Force and mothers locally who had lost children and others who were affected by violence for Mother's Day celebrations. Usually before or after Mother's Day, we would have aromatherapy and spa treatments and a free meal and and a speech and empowerment and singing and doing that just to say like, hey, we are here for you. We haven't forgotten, even if the media has moved on, we care and we haven't. Used to be a teacher, so I kind of came with the curricular resources, but we're going to speed on through. This is, for those who love music, another device, rap, rhymes, lyrics, and liberation. There are many songs that have been made in testimony and in tribute to Black lives from the early 90s to now. Dare I say, even civil rights songs hold the whole space here. And so artists like Lauryn Hill, Common, J. Cole, I kind of put a link to their music and then a little bit about what the music was about, when it was made, and having children discuss and discover that. So keep going, here's another mural that got a lot of traction of Breonna Taylor. This can be seen from space, we are told, and this was done in Annapolis, Maryland. I'm in the DMV area, so close to where I am. And there were several artists that came together and made this using these kinds of images to interrogate what is happening in the world and why. Great activity for children and adults. A lot of this is kind of images I've gotten from the Amplifier Foundation. They have a lot of free crowdsourced posters that artists have done and donated to them, and a great tool again for a gallery walk, a discussion, or just, you know, for an exhibit itself, for people to feel like there is a place they can just download art, put it up, and create that resonant experience. This is an image from the cover of the New Yorker of George Floyd, iconic image, things that we see in the media, again, especially the way art is used. We can interrogate memes, you know, this person does needlepoint in relation to some of the oppression she's seen. So I feel like there's a lot to this. This was done by a student at Temple University, Tyler campus, and they just erected this on the campus. It also got a lot of threats, and ultimately the university came to protect it. But when we think of, and I'm going to stop sharing there, when we think of empathy, right? When we think of designing resonant experience, we have to think of, again, the intergenerational, the young, the old, those with awareness, those with none, and how to plan for that. And what we can do to kind of be arbiters of ways to mind compassion across the difference. So I've been dedicating my life to this work. I'm sure you all have something to share. I want to stop there and take any questions or comments. Thank you very much.
Hi, so I'm Jessie. And by the way, I love your presentation. So I kind of like, I'm doing my master's thesis now with Professor Greg Stevens. And my thing is a conversation of how has the narrative in the media changed during Black Lives Matter in a particular museum. I'm looking at the Legacy Museum and the Memorial, the National Memorial Peace and Justice.
Nice.
I guess my question is like, do you feel, I have like two parts of this, but do you feel as if during Black Lives Matter, before Black Lives Matters, museums were not really having these type of dialogues? And then during Black Lives Matter, you know, the rise of it, there was an increased conversation about it. Everybody wanted to talk about it. And then afterwards, it died down. You know, I've from like research so far, I've noticed that the conversations around museums after like, let's say 2021, is not as text heavy, or it's not as intense or pushed forward as it was in the rise of it. I feel like it's a decline. That's really what my master's thesis is focusing on. I guess the other part I want to add is like the Legacy Museum and the National Memorial Peace and Justice. It is a place where I think fosters empathy. But I went the opening week. And one thing I did notice is there wasn't dialogue. Like, of course, there is a museum that does have all these very sensitive topics, sensitive collections, but I did notice there was a separation between my community as a Black woman and people outside of my community, that when they came to this museum, like they were uncomfortable and not being able to, it was like just given a heavy text and seeing people react towards it and nobody there to like have a conversation forward, like, hey, are you okay? Do you want to talk about this? So that being one of the first of its kind, that type of museum and that, you know, memorial, it's made me think about like, how do we have these conversations in these text or sensitive, heavy museums and organizations? So I guess that's my question. Like, what would be the best, like if you are coming to a museum like the Legacy Museum, I'm not sure if you've been there before, but when you mentioned thing about Orange is the New Black, they have an exhibit, I think that's called Orange is the New Black, talking about how enslavement has transitioned into mass incarceration and calling it Orange is the New Black. But I noticed like it made people very uncomfortable who were not of the Black community. And then there was no way to guide them. It was more like they'll leave the museum and they weren't able to decompress. I don't even know how to approach people of that community. So there was still this division. So I guess my question is that, like, what would be the best way, like if you are in a place that that kind of museum or organization that has such text-heavy, sensitive collections. And then you can obviously see the distinction and there's no way to bridge the gap because there's no open dialogue. It's just, here's the text, do as you will.
Thank you so much, Jessie. And I'm excited one day to read your thesis and let it become part of the canon as well. I haven't been to that museum yet. It's on my list. Next time I'm in the South, I plan to go. I am fascinated by them and certainly by the cult of personality of Bryan Stevenson. And I think he has so much to share, both as a lawyer and a leader. I think that the dialogic approach is really the heavy work that many museums shy away from, especially the well-funded ones. Not many people are up for talking with strangers. Even museum professionals I know, museum educators like, wait a second, like, what do we say? So I think you have to have a certain kind of approach and a certain kind of desire for the outcomes you want to see in your museum. To dive into that. Certainly it would have been amazing if they had like a cohort of racial justice educators or racial equity focused facilitators who could have those dialogues, who could make white people and Black people and Latinx people and people with different gender pronouns feel comfortable and a part of it, like they welcome and belonging. But that has to be planned. And the way that we plan and fundraise for exhibits is the way we need to plan and fundraise for the programming and or the addendum experiences that often stand out in people's minds more than the actual words and the text and the art on the wall. I think it would have been amazing, again, if that was there. I think that would be fitting for them to lead that dialogue. I don't know, how or when they could enact it, but I would love to see more museums doing that. I see museums do things like having reflection rooms, reading rooms, additional resources. Here's a place you can make art and add it to the wall. But certainly getting into that heavy dialogue, there's an art and a science to it, and I'd like to see it spring forth. I do agree, though, some of the urgency has left around the Black Lives Matter movement as other movements have kind of taken our sway in the media, and and now we're thinking around immigration and what's happening in Texas, and it's hard to keep up, right, with all of the social justice things that we want to see. But hopefully there is room for more of this. I hope that no more people are slain. But if they are, I hope we can turn our attention back and take action in these days.
Yeah, thank you. Just to keep adding to it, it's just like I went during the opening week and I went with my daughter. My daughter we're Dominican and Nigerian. So she taking her, she was like 4 months, and seeing how uncomfortable people outside my community were kind of pushed me to kind of are you when I saw people crying who were not part of my community, it was like, I had the feeling to go up to them are you okay? Is this something you didn't know? Or to try to have some type of dialogue. And I feel like that's something I really wanted to see in that museum, because though it's beautiful and I like that it's finally some type of organization that has a visual representation of the racial injustice, there was a lack of that. There was a lack of getting people to feel comfortable, because if it's going to be a place of healing, like how, Bryan Stevens calls it,
right,
it has to be a dialogue to bridge that gap. You can't just be context. If you look at their Instagram, even their community engagement, they have this calendar every day where they'll post on their stories some type of racial injustice that has happened in the past, every single day. So they're really good with engaging, giving, following up on their mission, because their mission is to educate. So they always do that. But the dialogue was very needed on that opening week, because it was in 2018, I felt like they had a lot of A-list celebrities come in the first week, but it was very important to have these dialogues throughout the week. They only had it 1 week, I think, of the first couple of weeks. But you went in there and it's yes, a place of healing for us, but is it a place of healing for people outside the community when they don't even feel comfortable speaking of it? So, well, that's all I had to add about it.
Well, thank you so much, everyone. I know out of respect of everybody's time, I'm okay to go over a little bit if you wish, but I don't know if you have any, other plans. If you wish, we can, have a few more questions. I would love to keep the conversation going for those, at least, who can just stay along. But I also dropped the link in the chat for a quick survey. I would really appreciate it if you can just fill it out before you leave, and we'll just send it with the email, but it's sometimes easier to just get it out of the way. And with that, I really I want to thank Monica for taking the time to join us and starting the empathy workshops and the summit with this very timely and thought-provoking and inspirational workshop and lecture. And it was enlightening for me, and also got me to think in different ways, and in terms of how I am trying to construct a new way to look at empathy in terms of the ingredients of empathy. So I already found, I think, maybe 5 new ones I discovered through Monica's sharings and the conversation and the chat and everything. Would you like to take do you have time to take one more question before we leave? Okay, anybody, would you like to ask a question? I see Brenda just dropped something. Okay, for Jesse, great. Great. Okay, then I think Greg has some connectivity issues there, so I'm going to wrap up for all of us. Thank you again for being here, and our next workshop is on Tuesday, I think on the 19th. I will have a workshop with Zorana Ivsevic, and we're going to tackle this object from the Smithsonian's Asian Arts Museum, and the object is going to be a surprise until the day of. But our engagement will be about how we interact with objects and how can we use them to learn about ourselves, how we look at the world. So looking forward to it. And great, Monica just dropped in her link or the name Monica Montgomery for any LinkedIn connections. Thank you for making that available. So looking forward to see you Tuesday. Thank you, Monica. Thank you. Take care. Oh, I guess maybe.
Bye.
So inspiring. Thank you, Monica.
I may need to just end it. Right, Greg? Can you hear me? Do I end it? Okay. I don't think he can hear us. Okay. Thanks, everybody. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.